Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. Let's take a look at today's top stories. The White House celebrates Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation today.
We're going to look back and see this as a moment of real change in American history.
Now that Jackson is headed to the Supreme Court, the reviews are coming in about her Senate hearing process. Was she treated as fairly as previous justices? We'll take a look. President Biden's goal to make half of all U.S. vehicles electric by 2030. How likely is it that he can reach this number? And what needs to happen to make sure we're doing so without relying on foreign adversaries? We'll have a look. Today, the White House celebrated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation to the Supreme Court. President Biden called it an historical moment. A day after the Senate's confirmation, Biden and Harris celebrated with Jackson at the Rose Garden.
We're going to look back and see this as a moment of real change in American history.
Jackson is the first black woman to serve on the nation's highest court.
First, as always, I have to give thanks to God for delivering me as promised.
The Senate voted 53-47 on Jackson's confirmation. Biden commended the three Republican senators who joined Democrats to vote Jackson in. Senators Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, and Lisa Murkowski casted their vote for Jackson to be the next Supreme Court justice alongside all Democrats. Biden slammed other Republicans for the tough line of questioning Jackson faced during the hearings. Over the past 40 days, Republicans have questioned gaps in Jackson's record and her lacking of judicial philosophy.
Based on her record, I believe she will prove to be the furthest left of any justice to have ever served on the Supreme Court.
Jackson will take the bench later this year, replacing retiring Justice Stephen Breyer. And as we told you, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed to the Supreme Court yesterday by a 53-47 vote, with three Republican senators voting in her favor. The analysis after her confirmation came from different angles as to whether she was questioned too lightly or not pressed enough on some key issues that may guide her decision-making process on the nation's highest court. Here to discuss with us, we're happy to have Pastor Lucas Miles. Lucas Miles, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Now, Lucas, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed to the Supreme Court yesterday. In hindsight, was her questioning by Republicans in line with the decorum traditionally maintained in the Senate chamber from your perspective?
I mean, I don't know what traditionally maintained anymore means, because I feel like every single time it just becomes an absolute circus during some of these questioning and confirmation hearings. I think that they let her off easy compared to what we saw with Amy Coney Barrett and others. And I think that they asked some of the tough questions, but they didn't push near as hard as I think some of the past candidates have been pressured and pushed on these particular issues. So I think that what we're seeing here is the double standard that exists sometimes on the left.
Do you believe anything may have been left on the table, or that you would have liked to have heard more from her, possibly about her religion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, look, there shouldn't be a religious test to hold office. I mean, that's a constitutional mandate that we have. But I do want to know about the faith of the people that we are putting in there. I think that there's still question. I don't even know if we know what church Judge Jackson attends, even though she claims to be a non-denominational Christian, or if she attends church. And so I think there's still a lot of things that Americans would benefit in knowing about, her as a new justice that didn't really make it out in these hearings.
Yeah, and to that point, what role does ideology or faith play when considering a Supreme Court justice?
I think it plays a major role. I mean, so much of what is being decided upon. I mean, somebody can say, "Well, I'm going to follow, court precedent," but once they become a justice, they can toss it out the window if they want. It's very easy to say things in these hearings, and I think what we need to see is track record. What we need to see is some of the ideology that's led that person to where they are today, before we really make that decision. And I'm a little disappointed that we had three, Republicans that sided with confirming her. And I think that's a little preemptive. I think there's more that needed to be addressed and more that need to be brought on the table. And frankly, what we're seeing is enough for me of basically, her past support for a lot of these progressive issues, and her softness on some of the, issues such as dealing with pedophilia and other things that and some of the leniency that she offered as a justice or as a judge. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I would have liked to see this gone a little longer.
On a slightly different topic, speaking of ideologies, you've studied critical race theory in depth. If you could just give us a roundup on what you've learned and what this ideology is all about.
Critical race theory is really just a form of critical theory that is focused upon ethnicity. And like any Marxist theory, it divides the world between oppressor and oppressed. You fit in either one of two categories. And so, for Marx, it was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. For critical race theory, it's essentially, white is the oppressor, and anyone who is a person of color is part of the oppressed class. And this brings up all sorts of problems in society. It's one of the worst ways to actually try to structure a civil society. And what we are seeing is that this is leading to really dismantling of the family, dismantling of Western way of thought, and it's really just only pitting people against one another based upon race. It's deadly, it's harmful, it's Marxist, and I think it should be rejected by everyone, left or right.
Lucas Miles, thank you.
Thank you.
Rising gas prices have left an opening for the Biden administration to push for a swifter transition to green energy. However, right now, China has cornered the market.
However, with China's dominance over the critical minerals required for the EVs, I have grave concerns about moving too quickly towards an EV-only future. China is responsible for 80% of the world's battery material processing.
Lawmakers have raised concerns about China's human rights record. The Chinese Communist Party uses forced labor. There's also a national security issue. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are now trying to find ways to ramp up production in America. Senators Manchin and Risch today introduced a bill to promote American nuclear energy without relying on China and Russia. These two countries currently dominate the international nuclear energy market. And Senators Marco Rubio and Cindy Hyde-Smith introduced a bill to develop rare earth manufacturing centers in the U.S.
As we've noted, we don't have many of those critical manufacturing industries today. They exist entirely in Asia.
To support more U.S. production, Manchin calls on environmental groups to get on board and stop filing lawsuits, which can block a new mine from operating for up to 10 years. But extracting minerals are only one piece of the puzzle.
Right now, one of the deficits in the critical mineral space is that no matter where those minerals are extracted, much of that goes to China for processing. And so the more that we reshore processing, the more we can sustainably provide manufacturers here a base for their critical mineral needs.
He lists a number of companies that are working towards processing minerals. President Biden's goal is to make half of all U.S. vehicles electric by 2030. But how long would it take to get there? Experts in the industry have varying responses.
It's almost impossible to get there, not just in terms of the United States providing those, but globally.
Our effort is to develop a circular economy for electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries by the 2040, 2050 timeframe.
We see a pathway where we can domestically source all these key critical minerals for millions and millions of EVs a year in just a few years.
And many in the clean energy field have said that President Biden has taken a crucial step toward producing green energy products here at home by invoking the Defense Production Act. But some critics are skeptical that this action will have the intended effect. So we'll see in the time ahead if President Biden's latest action here does make a splash in the green energy market. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
A Proud Boys leader pled guilty today on charges related to the January 6th Capitol breach. He pled guilty to conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, as well as other charges. According to the Justice Department, Charles Donahoe knew at least 1 or 2 days prior to January 6th that some members were talking about the possibility of storming the Capitol. The conspiracy charge alone could carry a sentence of 20 years. The case is being prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C. and the Justice Department's Counterterrorism Section. As part of a plea deal, Donahoe agreed to cooperate with authorities. A man in rural Alaska, J. Allen Johnson, was sentenced to 32 months in prison. He threatened to assassinate both of Alaska's U.S. senators in a series of profane messages left at their congressional offices. He was also fined $5,000 in order to serve 3 years of supervised release after his prison sentence. And the U.S. and Russia are at odds here on Earth, but today NASA launched SpaceX's private spacecraft to the International Space Station. The International Space Station is a collaboration between the U.S., Russia, and several other countries.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Stop. Go Falcon. Go Dragon. Godspeed. Axiom 1.
Each of them paid $55 million for the round trip and week-long stay at the ISS. They will arrive on Saturday. This is NASA's first tourist venture to the International Space Station. But since the 1990s, Russia has been taking private citizens to stay at their previous space station. The 3 businessmen will not enter the Russia-operated portion of the ISS. Entry would require negotiation with the 3 Russian cosmonauts who currently reside there. Although a no-fly zone is not happening, the U.S. took a major step today to help Ukraine defend its airspace. What's happening, and could this be a game changer? How much longer will the war in Ukraine last, and what should the United States' role be moving forward? We'll have a look. NATO leaders met to discuss their support for Ukraine. They recognized a new security threat on the horizon: Communist China. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capital Report. I'm Steve Lance. 3 weeks ago, President Zelensky made a plea to the U.S. Congress to help close the skies over Ukraine. And today, a major development unfolds as the U.S. announces cooperation with another NATO country to send Ukraine some unprecedented air defense aid. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
The U.S. is repositioning an American Patriot missile system to Slovakia. That's in return for the NATO ally donating an S-300 air defense system to Ukraine.
In the announcement that we're going to be providing a Patriot battery inside Slovakia tells you how seriously we take our Article 5 commitments inside NATO and the alliance.
Slovakia is the first to send an air defense system to Ukraine. Confirming the news on Friday, President Biden thanked the country and wrote that the U.S. reposition of the Patriot system will enable this transfer and ensure the security of Slovakia.
Thank you.
The move echoes President Zelensky's plea for countries to help defend Ukraine's sky by either imposing a no-fly zone or delivering air defense systems. Meanwhile, the latest aid follows reports that Russian troops bombed a Ukrainian train station, killing dozens. Russia said its forces were not involved in the strike, but the Pentagon on Friday said Russia's claims were unconvincing.
This was a Russian strike, and that they used a short-range ballistic missile to conduct it.
And with an apparent focus of invasion shifting to eastern Ukraine, the Pentagon said it will continue providing assistance that fits Ukraine's needs.
Whether that be weapons and systems and ammunition or information.
And the long-range Patriot missile system, along with U.S. crew, will arrive in Slovakia in coming days. This, as a U.S. defense official told reporters on Friday that the U.S. military has observed more than 1,500 Russian missile launches since the start of the war. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
As Russia continues its military operations in Ukraine, many Americans are asking what role should the United States be playing throughout this conflict? Well, a good person to ask about this is national security expert and executive editor at the Center for the National Interest, Harry Kazianis. We're happy to have him on. Harry Kazianis, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report again.
Thanks for having me again.
Harry, Jen Psaki was probed yesterday by reporters as to why we have not gone into war with Russia yet. And she simply said it's not in the best interest of the United States. Where does the interest of the United States lie in all of this?
Boy, that's putting it very, very bluntly and mildly. I mean, look, I think for the United States, the most important thing is to ensure that the international order is maintained. And I know that's sort of a wonky term, but to ensure that the United States has free flow of commerce, that its citizens are protected, that the country essentially is surviving, and not only surviving, but thriving. So that means the United States does not want to see a Russia-Ukraine war become World War III. I've literally fought those wars in scenarios. I can tell you every time it becomes a nuclear war, and actually the latest one I did, I'll give you a quick preview, 3 billion people died in that war. So the body counts get worse depending on how much Russia and NATO engage. So what Jen Psaki said is correct, and I think what she's trying to do is not go down that sort of World War III talk because it freaks people out, but I think what the United States is trying to do long term is to ensure Ukraine can protect itself, can ensure that the state is viable, that Vladimir Putin just doesn't scoop it up, but to also ensure that Russia doesn't try this again in the Baltics, Moldova, Transnistria, maybe make another play for Georgia. So reinforcing that international order, again, wonky, but that is the key.
Now, what do you say to the people out there that are, and there are many that are calling for war, and what do you make of that mentality?
It's suicide. I think it sounds sexy in terms of, getting page views on web pages and getting big headlines on MSNBC or CNN. But for those of us who have studied this issue, studied nuclear war, that would be it might be the end of human civilization. I mean, the Russians have almost 6,000 nuclear warheads. We have a very similar number. If NATO and Russia went to war over Ukraine, either through a no-fly zone or even through an accident, I mean, there's the possibility that a Russian missile could hit NATO territory. Joe Biden has said he will defend every inch of that NATO territory. Not exactly sure what that means, but the stakes of that sort of war are the apocalypse. They're things that would be in the Bible. So I don't think people fully understand when they call for, war with Russia or sanctions that would threaten the Russian state to such a degree that Vladimir Putin could be deposed in a coup or something like that. I think it's very clear Vladimir Putin would go out with all nuclear guns slinging, if you will, and that also could mean a nuclear holocaust. And that means billions of people die. But if you think COVID-19 was bad, ratchet that up by a million, and that's where we would be. It would be horrific.
Harry, I know people say hindsight's 20/20. I just want your thoughts. There's some school of thought from military experts that had NATO, European allies, the United States provided Ukraine with more MiGs, drones, javelins before, as they saw Russia building up troops, that this may have been a deterrent. Do you think that would have been a deterrent, or could it have made things worse?
Look, I think really this goes back to the Obama administration back in 2014 when Russia cleaved off a part of Crimea and parts of Ukraine. That was the time to start arming the Ukrainians. Now, we did to a small extent during the Obama years, but it was really during the Trump years that we started training the Ukrainian military on javelins, giving them small batches of javelins. And if the Biden administration was so certain that this invasion was coming, like they did say in all truthfulness over and over, an invasion's coming, they should have been bringing tons of javelins and laws, any sort of weapon that the Ukrainians wanted, drones, anything that they could need that would be helpful. But for whatever reason, they didn't do that. They relied on rhetoric, they relied on talk, they relied on disinformation campaigns, we're finding out now in some circles. So it really is a mystery of why they didn't provide what are defensive armaments to Ukraine as early and often as possible. I mean, it just doesn't really make any sense. They relied on words, they relied on diplomacy, and I think just anybody who studied Russian history 101 would understand that Russia respects steel, they don't respect words.
Now that we're here and we are where we are, is there a path to get back to some state of normalcy and reduce tension?
Not yet. I don't think Vladimir Putin is done yet for Ukraine. I think he realizes he can't take Kiev unless he bombs it to smithereens with his air force or with his artillery. I think he understands that the amount of sanctions that would be placed on him would be something that would probably bring down the Russian state. So now he's going to focus on Donbass. He's going to focus on eastern Ukraine. I think he will unleash his air force there, his artillery. I think it's going to be a bloody fight for the next 60 to 90 days. And that's where this gets dangerous. Again, all it would take would be an errant Russian missile, an errant bomber, a fighter to stray into NATO territory, and there to be some sort of shootout for this to spark a wider crisis. So this isn't done by a long shot just yet. The only way I can see it ending really relatively soon is if Vladimir Putin starts to think that maybe a coup is being hatched against him, if his grip on power is starting to slip, if the oligarchs around him decide, you're done unless you end this war. That might be a way to end this, but I think we're in for a bloody, like I said, 60 to 90 days.
Harry Kazianis, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
On Thursday, NATO foreign ministers met to discuss sustaining their support for Ukraine. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke for the first time about countering China as the regime fails to condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine.
We have seen that China is unwilling to condemn Russia's aggression, and Beijing has joined Moscow in questioning the right of nations to choose their own path.
NATO is now considering China a more serious threat.
And for the first time, it must also take account of how China's growing influence and coercive policies affect our security.
He said this new threat made unity more important. NATO allies have agreed to cooperate more with Australia, Japan, and other allies in the region as part of their strategy to strengthen the alliance. And that's all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.